Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are here today to share the results of a strategic planning work, which we began late last year. This webinar is set to record and it will be made available to all registrants and shared on our website and also in our July newsletter. A key goal of this webinar is for you all to better understand the plan and ultimately be supportive of the plan. Our plan can even be used to support one of your plans in the future if you'd like. So in order to be sure that you understand it well and understand where we came from and how we got to where we are, as we step through the webinar, please put any questions in the chat. We have a couple of opportunities to discuss them during the presentation and then also at the end of the presentation. Okay, well, good morning. Many of you, I think I've already met and recently got to see also at our state GIS conference. My name is Megan Compton. I'm our State Geographic Information Officer. I have the pleasure of getting to work with the team that's here. We're going to, as we introduce the plan, I want to tell a little bit about the folks from behind the scenes that help support this plan. Of course, many of you know our team members, Paul McBride, Sean Scholler, and even our prior team members who helps to support the project, Irv Goldblatt and Amanda O'Daniel. On the AppGeo side, you all know Jim Sparks, our former GIO for Indiana, helped support this plan, as well as Bill Johnson, Kate Hickey, and Peter Lemack, and my two esteemed presenters here as well.
Good morning. I'm Eric Ingbar with AppGeo. It's nice to be here with all of you. We have over 100 attendees, which I think is great.
That is great. Thanks, Eric. And I'm Michelle Giorgiani. I was the am the project manager on the strategic planning project, and also an active strategic planner on the project. I am a principal at AppGeo and love this work and love being here with all of you. Thank you. So now that we've got our introductions done, let's pop over to the map and see who we have. Great. That's awesome. So, it's interesting to see that we actually have a few participants from outside of the state, as well as many from the Indiana community showing up. So clearly, you have an interest in the Indiana GIS environment and are invested in this plan. So thank you very much.
So strategic planning might not be something with which you are very familiar. And even if it is, might not be a topic that naturally sets your heart racing. So I'd like for you to try thinking of strategic planning like something you are familiar with, like a base map. So just like a base map provides a foundation and structure for our future work, like shown on this slide, where the data and layers build on each other from a strong foundation, a strategic plan sets forth what an organization will strive to achieve and inputs that building and builds on that from the foundation of the organization's mission and values. A base map enables the work of the organization that the organization does and stakeholders can do with that base map. Our strategic plan is similar because it helps us do more for you, our stakeholders and our partners. We can use the plan to build from, and we will use this plan and updates for the next 5 years. And Michelle, I'm going to pass it over to you to help explain the approach and the plan.
Hey, thanks, Megan. All right, so let's begin with a little refresher of what a strategic plan actually is, and also what a business plan is. So in this project, we did both a strategic plan and a couple business plans. And it's really important to understand the difference between the two and the value that each brings. So starting with the top of the graphic, in the orangey tones is the strategic plan. So a strategic plan focuses on the vision for the future. It explains the why and the what, with a general description of how to reach the goals that are going to help you achieve the vision. Whereas a business plan, which is shown in green on the bottom part of the graphic, describes how to achieve the goal that's identified in the strategic plan in more detail. It's like an action plan for a particular goal in a strategic plan. So just to emphasize this a little bit more and go into something we're all familiar with is a map, of course. So a map analogy for this. The strategic plan would describe why you want to go to Morgantown and which of the several routes you could take to Morgantown. So, for example, you might want to promote high quality and music festival locations. And so what you would need to do is actually evaluate music festival locations. Therefore, the recommendation would be go visit potential festival locations in Morgantown. Whereas in the business plan, it would describe exactly which route to take. It's going to also describe when to leave, when you'll arrive, how much fuel to buy, where you're going to have your meals, what the trip is going to cost, who's going to go, and all of those nitty-gritty details that are very actionable. So now that we understand what we're talking about, strategic plans, business plans, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we went about developing the strategic plan for the Indiana GIO and what we actually did. So we started with information gathering, and we did that through document reviews. We did a survey, we held interviews, and we did a workshop. And the survey had a great response, just like this webinar. We had 251 responses in the survey. That's a lot. And then we held a 1.5 hour stakeholder workshop, and we had 38 participants there. We also did 10 small group or individual interviews with selected stakeholders. And now, based on all of the information that we gathered through all those methods, we compiled about 77 SWOT statements. So just a reminder, SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and as a way to analyze the information we gathered and organize it. So the SWOT, that formed the basis of the initial goals and recommendations that we developed for the strategic plan. So the whole team, both AppGeo and the Indiana teams, we all then worked to refine the initial goals and recommendations that we developed, and we turned that into the draft strategic plan. And that ultimately led to the final strategic plan. So we had a lot of participation in that information gathering work that we did. And we'd love to know how many of you that are participating today were part of that effort. So Aaron's going to launch a quick poll here so we can find out how many participated in the survey, the interviews, or the workshop. 37% of today's participants participated in the survey, about 10% in the interviews, about 7% in the workshop, and the largest chunk of folks on the call today, 60%, did not participate in any of those. And that's fine. That's okay. I think that the people that did participate in those activities well represented and provided a very rounded viewpoint for the entire GIS community in the state. And you will learn more about the outcomes of that. And thank you all for your participation. Your contributions during that time was a direct input into the outcomes that Eric and Megan are about to discuss.
Well, I would just make one comment here, Michelle, which is I think it's really great that 60% of the folks on this call today are here to learn about this, even though they didn't participate in some of that the information gathering that we did as part of the plan.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So again, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that now. All right, so now Eric and Megan are going to discuss some of the outcomes that came from all of that work.
Thanks, Michelle. So a strategic plan typically starts with a strategic vision, and the project team defined a vision for GIS coordination and the GIO, and it's a foundation of this strategic plan as it is for most plans. And the vision statement for Indiana really emphasizes something very important about GIS. Its value always lies in GIS and geospatial data being useful. It has to meet some need. You know, no one funds LiDAR acquisition just to have billions of coordinates laying around on a hard disk. It's to do something with all of that. And, you know, if you kind of step back, put yourself back 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you know, depending upon how long you've been in the geospatial data realm, you will, I think, almost immediately see that the uses of geospatial data just continue to blossom and grow. People discover new, interesting reasons for needing geospatial data and use it in new ways. They want new kinds of data. And really, one of the important parts of this vision is that the GIO supports these new and novel uses, as well as expanding the capabilities and value of meeting current needs and expanding on data that you currently use. So that's really the vision that the GIO has for providing, the big strategy for this plan is really being useful at all kinds of levels. So from that, then let's go look at the goals that came from this. And we're going to talk more about these in detail in a moment. But for now, I just wanted to show them to you all together, all four at once. And they are related to each other. So again, I'm not going to go into their details, but there are a couple of notes I want to make here. And as Megan and I talk about these in a moment, note that sometimes goals and recommendations do intertwine with each other between these different strategic goals. So a recommendation for one goal may also play into another strategic goal in some way. So, don't let that confuse you, but just recognize, like Michelle said, that if we're traveling to Morgantown, we might also stop along the way at one of the other towns that is a potential music festival location, because we're traveling through it in any case. So to return to Michelle's analogy for a moment. So as you'll see, moving towards some of the goals involves some recommendations to enhance, improve, and put more focus on even current GIO activities. So onward to looking at these goals in more detail. Let's go look at these four goals. The first goal is GIO leadership. And enhancing that leadership, I live in a state that does not have a GIO. So I can only sit here and be very envious of all of you in Indiana who have a GIO, who provides consistent and strong leadership and services and all of these things. So really, this goal speaks to that. And as you can see from some of these recommendations, Megan's going to talk in more detail about them in just a second here. That involves a lot of different kinds of recommendations and potential activities. So Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the right-hand side of the slide now. And this is how we will kind of process each of these goals. Over to you.
All right. Thanks, Eric. So the GIO leadership goal, really, there's a lot to unpack in these 6 goals within this larger goal. One of the priorities out of this goal is the creation of an advisory work group. So to put a little context behind that for everyone, several executives and administrators in various walks of life have advisory groups that advise them. The scope of the activities of our office, of the Geographic Information Office is involved with is really far ranging. And I think many of you understand that. For example, we are involved even in policies. We're also involved in very specific programs like broadband, imagery, Next Gen 911, and those areas of priority continue to expand. I'll be very honest, I'm not an expert. None of us can be an expert in all of these areas where GIS is utilized and where it has an impact. It makes sense for us at this phase of our office to bring a variety of perspectives that can also help to really shape that direction and be sure that we're meeting all of those needs of the policymakers, as well as those folks, many of you in the field trying to implement some of these projects and put forth your own priorities. So the work group will bring all of us together to help us meet the stakeholder needs. So just like IGIC has a board, for example, that helps to set the priorities, advise, and lead, this work group will serve as an advisory to the Geographic Information Office. IGIC and the GIO get to work collaboratively, but this group will help and be focused on the priorities of the GIO alongside all of our partners across the state. So I want to point out also goal 1.3. So many of these goals are new to the GIO, right? We haven't focused necessarily on many of these, but goal 1.3 specific to finding stable funding for the GIO, that is certainly not new. We've been working on that for several years since the inception of the office, since 2008. And where we were in every year trying to find sustainable funding. So making this a real priority is, and just in the time since finding this as a goal and the last several months, we've been able to make some major strides in trying to find that stable funding. So as we continue down this path, we are being responsive to legislation and we're being responsive to policies and priorities. And that's helping us in those areas as too for finding that stable funding. So Eric, I'll pass it over to you to go on to the next goal.
All right, thank you. The next goal is partnerships and collaboration with stakeholders as a strategic goal. And this is something that obviously the GIO already does. The data harvest is, many of you may not know, the data harvest is recognized nationally as one of the finest examples of local government, state government collaboration, and then data sharing with others of the results of that collaboration. So as you can see, looking at the recommendations on the left side, an important part of that is communication. Partnerships and collaborations really run on communication and on interaction with each other and having clear information passing between all parties, not both parties. So you can see that there are several kind of newer ideas that might be in here too, using partnerships to build what are called federated data frameworks. And that's a model in which partners and collaborators each contribute to data that is coherent at a larger level. So with those ideas, then that gives you some sort of sense of the flavor of this goal. I'm going to turn that over to you, Megan, to talk in more detail about it.
Yes, thanks, Eric. So like Eric mentioned, this set of goals speaks directly to one of our most active and visible projects, which is our framework data improvement, or otherwise known as the data harvest for some of you. The larger framework data includes 9 different layers. Local data from the data harvest, and as part of our ongoing effort, we also have the other 5 different layers: geodetic control, imagery, hydro, elevation. Those are all ones that we're actively working on as well to support those framework data pieces. So that outreach, the partnerships and collaboration with stakeholders, those projects don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen in a silo. They happen when everybody comes to the table and helps us understand what are the priorities, both technology-wise, what's new, what's on the horizon. So that communication and understanding what priorities are, and then helps us shape the framework data that we're going to be collecting. So I'll talk about the communications plan. We have another business plan we'll go into a little bit more detail with later, in addition to the advisory work group plan. So the communications plan, which is currently underway, is the last of our 3 plans that we're beginning to work on right now. This will share our priorities to the public and give us a lot of actionable steps in the right way to do that. We have many different forms of communication, right? We have our website. We also now have our Indiana map platform that allows us to share out information in a different way. We have our just communication across different work groups and different for-profit, nonprofit organizations that we work with across the state. So understanding the right way to do that communication and get information out to all of you, and then also get information back. We're looking forward to seeing what that plan sort of unpacks for us. The communication and outreach strategy will be developed to help us tell us a little bit more about what the community, about what we're doing, and properly share out really the progress of the strategic plan as well and the implementation of that. Eric, you want to go on to goal number 3?
Yeah, be happy to. So a few slides ago, I talked about how the vision for the GIO was all about several things, but one important thing was all about useful data. and being useful. And that is indeed the focus of Goal 3, IGIO delivery, improving data discovery and access, making web services a primary mechanism because many, many tools now use web services, and that broadens the value of data. And just a moment ago, Megan talked about Indiana Map and the data harvest. So those are all important parts of the strategic goal of improving what the GIO brings to the table for all of the stakeholders. Over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Eric. So Indiana Map is obviously one of our greatest priorities, has been for many years, and now it has taken on a new form in the management from our office. So with that open data portal, our responsibility is to appropriately and deliver the data sets in a way that's useful for all of the community. So we act as really like a broker. We collect data from local government, we collect data from universities, from state agencies, gather that and share that out to the public so they can be utilized in the maps that make all of your businesses run and help you achieve your goals. So how our data is accessed and made available for everyone across the sectors and enabling the use of those maps for everyone and location information to drive policy, that sometimes feels like that's our end priority. Right. We also want to enhance and expand the framework data sets. I mentioned there's 9 of them right now, but there's more that people are very interested. I'll use building footprints as an example. That's not on our list of the 9 framework data sets that are listed in the state statute, but it certainly is one that is very interesting to our users and also very interesting to government across the space, both at the local, the state, and the federal level. So enhancing and expanding those framework data sets include making some of those additional attributes available that are critical to government functions. Earlier, I mentioned NextGen 911, and we know that the different attributes that are necessary for the data for NextGen 911, the attributes that are necessary for that data are different than what we currently see. It's sort of like getting that data to the next level, really. So then making that data fair. This is an acronym that has recently come to our attention, and I really like it. So it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable. And we have a little website there if you want to go take a look at that. But where that came to my attention was from OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium, and talking about the way that we deliver data and making it as usable as possible to anyone utilizing any sort of tool set. So of all the goals, of the 4 goals that we sort of talked about in oversight, and we'll go on to goal 4 number here in a minute, the goal number 3 is probably one of the most technical of the goals that we have. There's very little technical pieces of the strategic plan right now, but it's probably our most technical goal because it also speaks to our infrastructure. And some of those infrastructure improvements are something that's been a high priority for our office for the last couple of years. So we continue to really focus and make sure that the infrastructure side internally supports the operations of the state agencies that are creating those data sets and making them shareable and accessible. And then that infrastructure is reliable for all of you to be able to receive the data, ingest it, and utilize it in a way that is as reliable and repeatable as possible. So we'll go on to goal number 4, which is back to maybe a more or less technical goal. Eric?
Well, goal number 4 in a way supports goal number 3, which is you can have great technology, but if you don't have the kind of people and organization to support it, then it's not going to go too far. It's going to sit in that big cardboard box that says Dell on the side. So the goal number 4 then is all about, as a strategic goal, is making the operations efficient and sustainable. And so that involves, kind of untangling, as we said earlier, the historical, hey, we all need to help each other here, and to try to make more routine and thus more responsive the office as a whole. And so in a way, this is kind of an internal goal in that it has to do with how the office operates. And with that, then I'll turn it over to you, Megan.
And so one of the activities that's coming out of goal number 4 is our roles and responsibilities business plan. We'll go into how that plan was created in a few minutes. But what was very clear to us and has been for a number of years, I think, is that we're not fully staffed to achieve what is outlined in the statute and what is expected of our team. So there's a need for realignment and focus in some areas, and also following and setting those programmatic priorities. So we're beginning to connect the roles and responsibilities business plan, which we will discuss, like I said, in more detail in a few minutes, to the funding and resources that our office has been working on actively. Like Eric said, these goals sort of really relate to each other. So goal number 4 speaks back to goal number 2. We're going to build the roles and support for to meet the recommendations alongside finding the stable funding in order to fill those roles and meet those responsibilities. It's also, speaking to the things we've been acting on a lot lately, which is connecting priorities and activities of our roles, of our staff to the priorities of government and the priorities of all of our stakeholders. So just like base maps, many of these goals tie together. They support one another. We are actively working on each of these 4 goals. So that's when we were planning and preparing for this webinar and understanding what our activities are in the office for both planning and for execution. It was validating to us from both a management perspective and a planning perspective that we are properly doing the activities that are setting for and working toward the priorities for the office. But Eric, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right, thank you. I believe that our next slide is a chance to answer any questions that have come in on the Q&A. There's one.
I can go ahead and field that one to the group here. So Wilma asks, good morning, this is Wilma from Idaho. Can you give me the statute and Indiana state code that contains the 9 base layers? Idaho code has nothing like that, and I would be interested in reading it. So kind of on the legislative side there, but surely important as well. Looks like someone has already jumped right with the answer into a link in the chat, but oh, that's Megan. Good. So yeah, it looks like you can find the full details there in that PDF. And thanks for asking. If any of you want to give any follow-up on that, feel free. But here to answer your questions as we go along.
Wilma, thanks for that question. The statute that I posted is the original statute. It did have a bit of an amendment last year, but nothing that changed the way that we operate, just related to some of their projects. But in that document, there's we sort of refer to it as a job description for the GIO, but it really helped us also in studying and making sure that everything that we do meets that statutory requirement, so that we're being very honest and delivering the things that our constituents expect us to deliver. Happy to talk to you about that more if you want to.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Looks like we're good for now. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on. Thank you. All right, so a little bit more about what we did in the project. So once we had all of those recommendations in place, those that Eric and Megan just talked about, we needed to prioritize them so that Megan and her team would have an idea on where to begin with implementing them. There's a lot to do here, so where do we start? So to do this, we prioritize them through the framework of an Eisenhower matrix, and that's where the level of importance is on the vertical axis and the level of urgency is on the horizontal axis. So we went through all of the recommendations. We had an interactive working session, and we placed each of the recommendations in their most appropriate quadrant. You know, are they high importance and high urgency, or are they high importance but maybe lower urgency? So we kind of did that analysis and moved them all into the appropriate quadrant. And you can see that recommendations in quadrant 1 are clearly going to be the highest priority, as they're both of the highest importance and highest urgency. So just a note that this graphic and any others in the presentation are also in the strategic plan, and we'll be sharing that link with you shortly. So if you're interested in going back to these graphics later, you can get them from the plan, or you can also look back at the webinar recording and slides. All right, so having the recommendations prioritized on paper is a good starting point, but sometimes reality isn't so neat, as we all know. So Megan's going to talk to us a little bit about the reality of the priorities.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of the things rose really to the top right quadrant, and how some of the other things maintained in their own quadrants. There's 20 goals here. So I want to speak to that. We can't do everything at one time. But as we mentioned earlier, many of these goals will relate to other goals. So sometimes part of the importance and the urgency of some of the goals that are in quadrant one are there because they need to be achieved, or they need to have progress in order to get to the other goals that are in quadrants 2, 3, and 4. So I want to talk a little bit also about the factors that got us to putting these in quadrant 1 or in quadrant 2, 3, and 4. Several of them are really environmental factors. There's things like budget cycles, the reality of personnel, and I mentioned the roles and responsibilities was really important for us to get right-sized. But the way also that we're moving in the IT infrastructure space, also supporting other state agencies and their priorities. Just like we're doing a strategic plan, we also study other state agency strategic plans to be sure that we are aligning with those state agency priorities, and also of our partners as well. But also, we have to be nimble to unexpected situations. For example, pandemic, perhaps, and how that might change some of the things that are rising to the top. Opportunities may present themselves where we might end up jumping from one quadrant to another quadrant because something becomes differently urgent. To use the pandemic example again, we might change the way that we need to deliver some services in order to be responsive to the different things that are going on in the environment. Sometimes also funding opportunities present themselves so that one of our priorities needs to be shifted around to take advantage of some of those funding opportunities that are in front of us. We can't do all of these priorities at one time, do all of these things at one time. So based on the plan's findings, based on all of your input, is really how all of these got into the quadrants to understand what's the most urgent and the most important goals to accomplish, and then how we can step into the remaining goals. So as I mentioned earlier, is some of what was in goal number 3 that we mentioned is more technical. Really, what's in quadrant number 1 is very non-technical. We've spent a lot of time in the last, since the GIO began, focusing on some things that were technical. How are we delivering data? How are we enabling infrastructure? How are we engaging with folks who need to be able to get their maps and make their applications? Some of what's in quadrant 1 is less technical, and the environment is really such now that we can and should focus on some of these less technical things to enable us to be in a different position to help set priorities and give everyone the tools that they need to get their jobs accomplished.
Right. So Megan has covered really a lot of what this slide is showing us. So in this slide then, and again, this graphic is in the strategic plan itself. But here you can see how those priorities then and recommendations get translated into a work plan that spans 5 years, 60 quarters. 20 quarters. Sorry about that. So here you can see that the goals are shown different colors, right? And you can see how those recommendations get implemented at different times. They start in different quarters, and they may run for estimates of 2 to 3 quarters or more. But some, once started, then become enduring, ongoing activities. So, for example, if you look at find stable funding for the IGIO, that's something to focus on during the first year. But then the next item down, leading data governance and working on, and even the one below that, national leadership, those things are things that one is always going to be working on. So even though the matrix may indicate that, for example, for 1.5, Q1 of, which would be year 2 through the end of year 3, I believe, would be the focus for that. But then it becomes an ongoing activity. And this is part of what Megan was saying earlier, which is, you can't pick up everything at once, but there are some things that once you pick them up, you kind of have to keep after them in some fashion. And that ties right back to that realignment within the GIO itself, roles and responsibilities. It ties back to the notion of stable funding, it ties back to communicating with partners, in this case, so forth. So you can see that really these strategic goals get implemented over time, over these next 5 years. And some of them remain ongoing, really almost half of them. And the timeline notes then speak to places where there might need to be some coordination, or as you can see in the example of 3.1, improved data discovery and access, we'll naturally begin with Indiana Map 2.0. So some further information there for you. Megan, over to you. No, this one's mine too. Thank you. Sorry about that. So we've talked to you then about the strategic plan and identified for you the 4 goals. And so I think you can see that the strategic plan, as Megan said at the start, really is kind of the base map for the GIO, right? Just as in a base map, as Megan mentioned, you may decide these are the important kinds of data to have. And as Michelle said, you then have to figure out how are you going to gather that data? How are you going to implement that? How are you going to get parcels? How are you going to get roads? Do you need geodetic control first? Probably. So consequently, then let's talk now about the business plans just a little bit. So I believe that takes us over to you, Michelle.
Right. Thanks, Eric. So in this project, we have 3 companion business plans. So 2 have already been developed, the advisory work group business plan and the business plan to align the roles and responsibilities of the GIO with the strategic plan. Those 2 plans are done. The 3rd business plan we're working on now, and that's to improve communications. So this graphic really just shows the general workflow for how we develop the business plans. And I'm using the roles business plan as the example to illustrate this. So to develop the business plan, we started with an outline, and that outline is informed by the FGDC guidelines for business planning. And we adapted that outline to the Indiana GIO situation. And then the team, the AppGeo team, brainstormed on the steps that that Megan's team would need to take in order to accomplish the recommendation of aligning the office's roles and responsibilities to the strategic plan. This then led to a list of objectives that ultimately framed the business plan's implementation plan. And it also led us to ask several questions of Megan and her staff. Major question being, what are all the responsibilities of the office currently? And what are the responsibilities that you foresee on the horizon? And how much time is spent on each of those responsibilities or should be spent on those responsibilities? And we also needed to understand things such as what are the costs of the staff currently? What are the costs of any potential new positions that might be hired through this effort? What's the budget cycle look like? And many other things. So from there, we worked with Megan to analyze all the information we gathered from her and her team on that. And we prioritized all of those responsibilities that her team came up with in a big list. And we grouped them to align with the roles of the office that were defined in the strategic plan. And we analyzed the level of efforts for each role through pivot tables. That ultimately led us to determine that we needed some new roles and positions in order to make that alignment feasible. And that culminated in a new organizational chart for the office. So the arrow, the orange arrow there that you see, that just signifies that the information gathering and the analysis process was iterative. And that's because we would analyze the information that we gathered and we'd learn more, and then we had to get more info and we had to reanalyze it until it all aligned. So finally, we took that information and we wrote the business plan. And the business plan described the objectives, the outcomes of the analyses, the resources that will be required, and an implementation timeline. Megan.
Michelle, thanks. So the business plans really are a means of explaining to your peers and cohorts horizontally what you are doing, and vertically to your executives what you want to do or why you're doing what you're doing. Why we decided on these three plans. So we have the advisory work group plan, the roles and responsibilities plan, and the communications plan. We decided on these because they are large enough in scope that they really needed a little bit more horsepower and organization so that they could happen in the right way. These three plans do not mean that other activities to support our goals are by any means being ignored. For these three, we really just needed a little bit of extra help, or a lot of extra help and support, understanding how to do some of these things. It was the process for the roles and responsibilities plan was probably one of the more interesting things that I've been involved with in my professional career. Understanding and really putting numbers, quantifying what we do on a daily basis and what it takes to do it well. Understanding where we're missing things because we don't have the right resources. Out of this business plan came an org chart that wasn't just a guess. It's absolutely unique. And but how do you know if you need 4 people or 6 people to do a particular job, or 1/2 FTE full-time equivalent, or if you need a full-time person on that? So understanding level of effort and time and engagement was a difficult process, but thanks to the folks and patience of the folks on the AppGeo team and the support, we were able to really come up with a really solid plan. These also responsibilities, understanding things that are what you might call episodic, or other things that are routine. So things that happen, I'll use imagery as an example. So we're only actually actively managing the flights about half of the year. The other half of the year, we're managing some of the data and the delivery and the planning for the next year. Well, the resources needed for those two different levels of the project are different. Also, if you're only flying imagery, or if you're also collecting elevation, that changes the number and the amount of resources that you need for that particular program. So understanding that was really necessary for us to get to hard numbers, really, of what kind of staff that we would need to be appropriate to address the things that our office needs to do. The business plan also allows us to reassess. So using the same formula that we used to develop the plans, and how we got here within the 5 years, or 5 years from now, is going to look a little bit different. But we'll be able to go back to that same plan and assess, and utilizing the same math and the same tools as much as possible to see, okay, in 2027, where are we and where do we need to be? And do we need to realign some things? And we can use the reassessment with we can do the reassessment with those same tools. So it, for us and for my position as a hiring manager, and trying to justify, and we've all probably at some point in time needed additional staff, to be able to take a well-done plan with an org chart and an outline for the funding that is necessary. It's not enough for me to go to our executives or to our hiring folks and say, I need this because I have a feeling. Now I have something to really rely upon to say, this is how we got here, and this is exactly what we need in order to achieve our goals. So that business plan in particular was extremely helpful for us, and very, very interesting to do. So I want to talk a little bit about what's coming up next. So in July, we actually, coming up, and over the last several weeks, we've opened up at least one position, and we're actively acting on that roles business plan. we're trying to get to the level that we need to be at in order to achieve the goals that we have. So starting fiscal year 23, we will start working on we'll continue to work on the roles business plan and implementing that. And then we'll also move on to the work group and the internal planning for that, utilizing the business plan that we just finished. Later on, we'll be bringing in and reviewing the communications business plan and figuring out what the actions are from that. And then it's coming up before we even know it. In October, we'll already be going back and doing a self-assessment on the entire plan and see, are we still on the right track? Do we need to pivot? And what additional resources or what change in resources do we need to make so far?
Thank you, Megan. So we did mention that we're just starting on the communications business plan. And so to that end, we'd like to understand from you, what is the best method for Megan and her team to keep you all informed of the progress that's being made by the GIO and to help you understand how it's going with the business plan implementation and the strategic plan implementation. So Aaron, if you could launch this last poll, we can get some feedback from the audience. And hey, this is input into our communications business plan already. So you are now an active participant in information gathering. We have a pretty close tie between the IGIO newsletter and the direct email, 67% and 65%. And then next after that is further webinars. So that's great feedback. Thank you all so very much. Okay, we have a question about the advisory work group. Megan, would you like to take this question? It's from Robert Wilkinson, and he says, where do you see the advisory work group coming from, and how or who selects the members, and will it be mandatory?
Okay, all right, Bob, thanks for that question. So in the business plan, it kind of outlines all of the pieces. And when you go to the strategic plan, you'll see the makeup of the advisory work group that we're really striving toward. Input will come from various organizations, various levels of government, maybe more on the less technical side, more on the strategic or policy side, specifically to that work group. Also support from internal state agencies and support from IGIC. So all of those groups come together to help support that. Will it be mandatory if you're if you're assigned to or asked to work on an advisory work group? There's a responsibility to be there and be present. So, and obviously, those people's input is going to be critical in the direction that we take for many of the policies and things that we take on over the next couple of years. I think, did I answer all of that question, Michelle? I
believe so. Yes.
All right.
But as Megan said, there's a lot of information and background and on the formation of the work group and the strategic plan, and then there's also the specific business plan that guides exactly how to make that happen. All right, and finally, Megan.
Okay, so here is a QR code and a link to the strategic plan. I encourage you to take a look at it, review it, get on board, give us some feedback, stay involved. So appropriately so, the strategic plan is delivered in the form of a story map. When I've seen strategic plans in the past, they've been delivered in a paper format. They get put on a binder, either physically or digitally, and put on a shelf. The goal here is that this is a living document that we can edit, we can update. And the story map format was really a fun process to go through in order to properly deliver all of the information and be able to really direct folks. So when I think about who we communicate with in the governor's office, for example, I can really direct them to a specific spot on the story map. And if we have other partners and stakeholders that want to know our priorities, our direction, we can really show them on the story map where we're headed. So I encourage you to use the QR code, go take a look, scroll through it, and provide any feedback that you'd like to. And just like a base map, our thinking is that strategic planning will be refined over time, right? All of those pieces that lend to the foundation of what we do they have to be adjusted and they have to be refreshed. So we would love your help with that and hope that you will look at the plan, review it in detail, and stay engaged with us.
Great. Thanks, Megan. So we've got another question from Lorraine Wright, and she's asking, how will the communication work between the IGIO and IGEC?
Lorraine, probably the way that it does now. We stay actively involved as much as possible, obviously with the IGEC board and the executive committee. My hope is that as we are engaging and expanding our team, that we'll be able to be more involved in some of those committees and work groups as well, because the fantastic work that comes out of the community within IGEC really helps steer some of our priorities and helps us understand the things that we not in our small team might not have some visibility into. So I would say just the way that it is, but we might learn some more of that through our communications business plan. And if you have other input, I'm happy to take it.
And also I would add that in the strategic plan, we recommended that that IGEC have representation or be represented, be kind of coordinated within the advisory work group. Mm-hmm. All right. Do we have any other questions? Tom DeBon says, I have a concern about the format chosen for the IGO newsletter. I understand that a lot of GIS professionals are ARC users, but I suspect several smaller agencies with limited budgets are not. Some accommodation needs to be given for us.
Michelle, do you want to take that?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that I think we're going to be addressing just this type of thing when we work on the communications business plan, because one of our recommendations in the strategic plan is to consider the different audiences that the IGIO is communicating with and their level of use of GIS, their technological prowess, the software that they might have, and kind of gear the different communications and methods and messaging based on the different types of audiences that are in the community. So thank you for raising that concern, and it's definitely going to be addressed. I think that's it for the questions. One last chance if anybody's got anything, if they want to put into the Q&A. Well, if not, we can wrap it up. And here's Megan's contact information if you have any additional questions. And thank you all so much for participating. Thank you for being a part of this process and for being interested and invested. Megan, would you like to say anything?
I think you just covered it pretty well, Michelle. The input from this group is absolutely critical. Thank you so much for spending time with us today to understand our plan, where we're headed, and we are open to feedback, and hopefully we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.